Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something big. We're tackling the history of the internet today, thanks to those who suggested it. It's amazing to think how much it's changed our lives.
It's almost impossible to imagine life without it now.
Right. So we've got Wikipedia's article on the history of the internet pulled up, ready to go. I'm really curious to see, how did we get from those clunky old computers to, well, all of this?
Well, it's actually a fascinating journey, full of twists and turns you might not expect.
Okay, so no time machine then. Guess we'll start with the early days.
Even earlier than you might think. Our story actually begins with telegraphy, way back in the 1800s.
Telegraphy, wow, like Morse code and all that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that was revolutionary at the time, sending messages electronically. But it wasn't exactly what I'd call efficient.
It had its limitations, for sure. Costly, slow, and you could only send to one place at a time.
Not exactly built for sharing memes.
Not quite. But it was a crucial step. Telegraphy showed us the limitations of point-to-point communication. Okay, I see. So what changed?
Well, in the 1940s, we have Claude Shannon enter the scene. He kind of wrote the rule book for the information age with something called information theory.
Information theory.
Yeah, basically figuring out how to send data reliably, even with interference on the line.
So like making sure your message doesn't get garbled up in the digital mailroom.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've got the rules down, but how did we actually start sending this data?
Computers, right.
Right. Those early computers were behemoths, but they paved the way. And then came those glorious clunky modems.
Oh, I remember those days. The dial-up sound, the waiting.
But think about it. Those modems were using existing infrastructure, the telephone lines. We were adapting, finding ways to send data over networks originally built for voice.
Clever. But we're still a long way from the internet as we know it.
Oh yeah, we've got a bit to go. And this is where things get really interesting with the idea of packet switching. Imagine, if you will, a network so resilient that it could survive a nuclear attack.
Okay, that's a pretty intense image. That was the goal, though. And the man with the plan was Paul Barron, back in the early 1960s. He was way ahead of his time.
So what did he come up with?
He envisioned breaking data down into small packets, each with its own address. They could be sent independently across the network. So instead of relying on one single line of communication, if one route was blocked, the packets could just take another path.
So instead of a fragile chain, it's more like a swarm of bees all heading to the same hive, taking different routes.
Exactly. Barron's work was visionary, but the technology wasn't quite there yet.
So close, yet so far. What happened next?
Well, at the same time, but completely independently, a researcher named Donald Davies in the UK was also working on this packet switching idea.
No way, great minds think alike.
Right. And Davies managed to make it a reality with something called the NPL network.
The NPL network. Tell me more.
It was the world's first operational packet switched network.
Wow. So the first time those packets actually flew, so to speak.
Yes. Now, it was a small-scale proof of concept, but it showed the world that packet switching was more than just a theory. It worked.
Okay, things are getting really interesting now. We've got the seeds of the internet planted. But how did we get from a small network in the UK to, well, the global phenomena we have today? So packet switching, it works. The ball is rolling. But I imagine there were some growing pains, right? A lot of different ideas about where to go from there.
Oh, absolutely. It was like the Wild West out there, with different networks popping up, each with its own way of doing things.
So a bit of a network free-for-all.
Pretty much. But it was an exciting time, a lot of innovation happening.
I bet. So amidst all of that, we have the big one, right? ARPANET, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, connecting universities.
Right. ARPANET was definitely a major player, no doubt about it. But even then, it wasn't the only game in town. Remember, this was a time of experimentation.
Okay, so what else was going on?
Well, for example, in France, there was the Cyclades network. This one was important. They really pioneered the idea of the end-to-end principle, something that's still fundamental to how the internet works today.
End-to-end. What does that even mean?
So imagine you're sending a package. In the old way of doing things, the network itself would be responsible for every step of the journey, making sure it arrived perfectly intact, But with the end-to-end principle, that responsibility shifts. It falls on the sender and the receiver, not the network in between.
Okay, so the network is more like a highway, just providing the road.
Yeah.
And the packages are like well-prepared drivers, making sure they reach their destination themselves.
Exactly. It might sound strange, but that shift was huge. It made the internet much more efficient and flexible.
So instead of trying to control every single bit of data, the network could focus on just keeping the connection open.
Precisely. And that's just one example. You also had X.25s, which was a really important step because it was the first public data network standard.
Ah, so this is when things start to become a bit more, well, standardized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with X.25, you start to see more commercial use of these networks. And it even enabled international connections. It was a big deal.
Okay, so things are starting to take shape. We're connecting across borders, different types of networks. It's like the world was shrinking, but digitally.
That's a great way to put it. And we can't forget about things like email and news groups. Remember those?
I vaguely do. My dad used to be glued to them.
Right. And those were often running on something called UCP Usenet. Now, this was interesting because it was a decentralized network, often using, get this, existing phone line.
Using what they had available. Very resourceful. But still, with all these different networks and protocols, were they even speaking the same language?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it was a major challenge.
So how did they solve that? Did someone invent a digital translator or something?
You're on the right track. And that, my friend, brings us to TCP/IP, the brainchild of two brilliant minds, Vinton Cerf and Bob Kahn. They're often called the fathers of the internet, and for good reason.
Okay, so TCP/IP, what's the big deal?
This was it. This was the common language that allowed all these diverse networks to finally communicate with each other.
Ah, the missing link. So TCP/IP was like a universal adapter for the digital world.
Exactly. No more digital Tower of Babel. It was a game changer.
Okay, so now we're really cooking. We've got this shared language. We've got networks connecting across borders, different purposes, even different technologies. But I imagine it was still pretty limited, right? Mostly universities and researchers, I'm guessing.
You're right. It was still a relatively small and exclusive club at that point. But things were about to change again, and this time it was a change that would open the doors to the internet as we know it.
Okay, you've got me on the edge of my seat. What happened next?
Well, remember ARPANET? It was great, but it had its limitations.
Yes.
It was seen as being too, well, research-focused, not very accessible to the average person or even businesses.
Right. So how did that change?
Well, in the mid-1980s, a pivotal shift took place.
Yeah.
The transition from ARPANET to NSFNet.
NSFNet, another acronym. Break it down for me.
The National Science Foundation Network. Basically, the National Science Foundation stepped in with funding to create a new backbone for the internet.
And this was different from ARPANET, how?
NSFNet was designed to be much more open, accessible to more universities, and even some commercial entities.
Ah, so this is when the internet starts to look a bit more like what we're used to.
Exactly. But of course, with more users, more traffic, more everything, those early networks, even with TCP/IP, were starting to feel the strain.
Ah, the early days of lag, that hurry up and wait feeling we all know and love.
You got it. And that brings us to another crucial turning point, the need for speed.
So the internet was getting bogged down, kind of like rush hour traffic on the information superhighway.
Exactly. And just like with a highway, the answer was to build more lanes, metaphorically speaking. That's where fiber optics comes in.
Ah, those magical cables that carry data at lightning speed. I've heard those things are thinner than a human hair, but can carry, like, all the cat videos in the world at once.
Something like that. Optical networking was a game changer, no doubt. Lasers and fiber optic cables allowed us to send data much, much faster. And suddenly, we're on the road to the high-speed internet we're all so used to.
And speaking of things we're used to, there's still one big piece missing from this puzzle, right? I mean, we've got speed, we've got connections, but the internet as I know it, the one with all the cat videos, that's all about the World Wide Web, isn't it?
You got it. And that's where Tim Berners-Lee comes in. He's the genius who gave us the World Wide Web back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, so the World Wide Web, not the same as the internet itself. I always get those two confused.
It's an easy mistake to make. Think of the internet as the infrastructure, the roads and cables and all that. The World Wide Web is what runs on that infrastructure. It's the way we access and share information using web pages, hyperlinks, all that stuff.
So like the difference between, I don't know, the postal system and the actual letters people send.
Exactly. And the World Wide Web made the internet so much more user-friendly. Suddenly, you didn't need to be a computer scientist to navigate this world. It was for everyone.
And that's when things really exploded, right? I remember the dot-com boom, everyone and their dog starting a website. It felt like the Wild West all over again, but this time with more, well, cat pictures.
It was a wild time. The dot-com bubble eventually burst, but it showed just how much potential people saw in this new more accessible internet.
It was a glimpse of the future, and everyone wanted in. But even with all this growth, didn't we hit a snag, like a really big snag?
You're talking about the IPv4 address exhaustion.
That rings a bell. But refresh my memory, what was that all about?
Basically, we ran out of internet addresses. Every device that connects to the internet needs a unique IP address. Think of it like a phone number.
Okay, I'm with you.
Well, the system we were using, IPv4, only had so many addresses to give out. We were literally running out of numbers.
So what do we do? Just order a bigger batch of numbers?
In a way, that's where IPv6 comes in.
Yeah.
It's a new addressing system with a vastly larger address space, enough for every grain of sand on Earth to have its own IP address, and then some.
Okay, that's a lot of addresses. Problem solved. So we're good now. The internet just keeps growing from here on out.
Not quite. Just as we were transitioning to IPv6, another revolution was happening. The mobile revolution.
Right. Smartphones. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just something you accessed from your desktop computer. It was in your pocket, everywhere you went.
And with smartphones came a whole new wave of innovation. Apps, mobile-first websites, and of course, social media.
And that's a whole other story. The rise of social media, the way we connect and communicate now. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And it's still unfolding, just like the internet itself. That's the thing about this technology. It's constantly evolving, changing the way we live, work, and interact with the world.
It's amazing when you think about it. We started with telegraphs, those clunky old machines tapping out messages one letter at a time, and now look at us.
It really makes you wonder what the future holds, doesn't it? What will the internet look like in another 10 years? Another 50?
It's exciting and maybe a little bit daunting, but one thing's for sure, it's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold. So to all our listeners out there, the next time you're scrolling through your favorite app or watching a cat video, take a moment to appreciate the incredible journey that brought us here. From those early pioneers to the countless innovators who shaped the internet as we know it, it's a story of human ingenuity, collaboration, and a relentless drive to connect and share. And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating journey into the world of information.